It's the 23rd straight Saturday of anti-government rallies in France as the so-named Yellow Vests gather again nationwide. It's the first turnout since the Notre Dame Cathedral blaze, with protesters' anger directed at the vast amounts of money donated for repairs. Police in Paris have already used tear gas and have arrested at this stage 137 people, we believe. Live to Paris now, and our correspondent Charlotte Dubinsky. Charlotte, how are today's protests therefore panning out? We just saw some of the images of earlier on. And has indeed the Notre Dame fire influenced events in a great way?
Well, what we're seeing is, again, tensions on the streets in Paris. There have been skirmishes between the police and protesters at several junctures, including at the Bastille and also at République, where some of those demonstrations are taking place. We understand around 7,500 people taking part in that demonstration in Paris. That's one of many going on across the country. We won't get the full figures, though, for the number of people who are out across France until probably at some point on Sunday. But in those tensions, we've already seen cars being burnt, we've seen bins being set on fire, rubbish strewn on the streets, and then that's set on fire. We've seen the protesters throw bottles and bricks towards the police and the gendarmes, and we've seen them retaliate, of course, with that tear gas. Those skirmishes really heating up in the centre of the city. As you mentioned, this is now the first Yellow Vest protest since Notre Dame Cathedral burnt on Monday night. That fire at the time we thought was uniting France. It actually happened about half an hour before President Macron was due to give a big address to the nation, his second address in regards to the Gilets jaunes, and his first after this big debate that France has been having now for the last few months since the Yellow Vests protests started back in November of last year. The idea was to address the issues that people had raised during this big debate that, you know, took itself all around the country, saying it was listening to people. But before President Macron could tell the Yellow Vest protesters, tell France what he was going to do to improve their situation, Notre Dame Cathedral burnt down. Now, people in France that night stood out in Paris, watched what was happening. They waited with bated breath. People watched it on the news, and there was a moment of solidarity. But that came quickly undone within 24 hours after it emerged that hundreds of millions of euros had been raised for the reconstruction of Notre Dame. And many people, including Yellow Vest protesters, saying, how can you raise hundreds of millions of euros to rebuild a cathedral when you can't deal with the issues that we're facing here in France? Now, these issues, don't forget, this Yellow Vest protest has always been about the high cost of living in France. That included the taxes on fuels when it started out back in November, but always about the cost of living and how so many people in France just cannot eke out a living here because of that. And let's just take you through some of the figures on that. Last year, the latest figures, which were from 2017, showed that 8.8 million people in France are living below the poverty line. That means that they're surviving on just under €1,000 every month. That's entire families. We also know that there are 12,000 people sleeping rough across the country. Many of those are sleeping rough here in the capital, and that has really irked many of the people who support the Yellow Vests. That's some of the reasons why we're seeing more engagement again this week, and it looks like they're coming out in strength. The other thing that we're seeing, and this is the Black Blocs movement. This is a movement that has come out at several points throughout the Yellow Vest protest. These are ultra-radicals from the rest. They're anti-capitalists. They're trying to tear down the state, and they're the ones that we saw just a month ago on the Champs-Élysées when they were burning buildings down. Now, President Macron and the Interior Minister, Christopher Castaner, actually met today to discuss this. And what we know is that there is a strong response on the street. There's thousands upon thousands of gendarmes and police all out there trying to tackle the protesters. We know that many people have been injured. We know many people have been arrested. You mentioned there are around 137 arrested. We believe of those, around 110 have actually been placed in custody as a result of that. And even more so, more than 14,000 preventative checks have taken place just in Paris today. I want to give you a sense of how big that is compared to last week. Last week at the same time, there were under 6,000 preventative checks. This is why we know that the government was very fearful that